Hey team, let's start our overview of animal phyla. So here we go. We're going to start with these sponges. So if we look at our animal phylogeny, right, remember all animals come from one common ancestor. And then our very first split is we split up the animal tree into those that have true specialized tissues and those that do not. So the first group we're going to talk about are these parazoa down here, meaning next to animals. They are animals, but they're lacking some of the characteristics that we use to categorize animals usually, right? So the phylum Porifera, the sponges. So that's our first group. So let's talk about them. What's going on there? So the sponges in phylum Porifera, these are mostly marine, sometimes freshwater, but regardless, they're all aquatic species. So they're all living in an aqueous environment, they're living in water. They are all sessile, meaning that they don't move in their adult stage at least, right? Some of them, well, all of them have free-swimming larvae that will swim away from the parent, but in their adult stage, they are sessile, okay? They are stuck in one spot, and they are filter feeders. So they're pumping water through their bodies and they're trapping bacteria, viruses, microorganisms, things like that. So they're filtering out water and then that's how they're getting their food. Okay. And typically we're going to find most sponges living in usually quiet waters where there's not a lot of wave action stirring up sediment. So they're typically pretty clear waters as well. And that's because all that sediment that's mixed up with waves and things like that can clog some of their pores into their body, which makes it hard to feed. Okay, so typically you're going to find them in areas where there's not a lot of waves and water movement going on. So if we look at these sponges, for a long time, biologists didn't really know what to do with them because they don't really look like other animals, right? They don't move in their adult stage. They just stay in one spot. They don't have any body symmetry either. So these species are typically asymmetrical. There are a few that show somewhat of a radially symmetrical, but typically we just classify phylum Porifera as being asymmetrical, meaning they do not have any lines of symmetry to their body. They also don't have any specialized tissues, right? So we talked about endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm previously. We don't see any sort of specialized cells working together for a common goal in these sponges. They're almost clonal-like in a sense, but we do see some specialization within the cells themselves, but not multiple cells working together for a common goal to create a tissue, right? So sponges are filter feeders, aquatic, sessile in their adult stages, free-swimming larvae. We think that they resemble in some ways the protist common ancestor of animals. So we think that all animals evolved from one common ancestor. We think something like this right here, this choanoflagellate. But the reason why we think that sponges are most closely related to this protist is because we see a specialized cell called a choanocyte cell in the sponges that exists in pretty much the same form in the body of sponges. Okay, we'll talk about the sponge morphology in just a second. But sponges, ecologically, they're really good at continuing to move nutrients through the food chain. So they're eating detritus, they're eating microorganisms, things like that. And so they're good at recombining all of that material, all the nutrients that they eat from the dead stuff and the microorganisms, and sending it on up the food chain when something comes along and eats a sponge, right? As far as humans go and why we care about these, some of us may use them, sponges, for cleaning, for loofah, things like that, right? So if you have more of a natural sponge like this that has many very differently sized openings, your normal typical like bright pink or orange square sponge with very symmetrical openings into it, that's not going to be a natural sponge. That's not an animal. That's manufactured, synthesized. But if it's something like these loofah-like things, those are natural sponges that are harvested, and they can be a large part of some islands' economies sometimes as well. And then on top of that, we've been able to isolate bioactive compounds from sponges. Some of them are antiviral, some of them are cytotoxic. There might be some anti-cancer bioactive compounds in sponges as well. So there's the potential for a lot of pharmaceutical research and development going on with sponges. So let's dive into a sponge. Let's see what it looks like. So we're going to cut this sponge in half. Kind of cut it in half like that. So we're going to go more in depth and see what's going on here. So the way sponges work is they have these specialized cells, those choanocytes, that are lining their internal cavity inside that sponge. And those choanocytes are flipping their flagella back and forth, which creates a general movement of water from the outside into the sides of that sponge, and then it shoots up out through the osculum. So water goes in through the sides through openings that we call ostia, and then up out through the top through the osculum. And so that's how the sponge is able to move water through its body. As it's moving water through its body, these choanocytes, as they're flopping their flagella, they are ringed by these collars. And these collars are what trap the food particles, the viruses, the bacteria, detritus, things like that. And so the actual eating of the sponge, the actual feeding of the sponge, happens at these choanocyte cells. And then what's really cool is that they don't have the circulatory system, they don't even have tissues, but the choanocyte cells can pass off that food that they just ate, whatever they just ate, they can pass it off to an amoebocyte. So this amoebocyte, these are basically undifferentiated cells that can move within the body of what we call the mesohyl of the sponge, this middle section right here. They can move around, and so maybe if these choanocytes and these cells up here in this region of the sponge, maybe if they haven't gotten any food in a while, those amoebocytes would move to that area and deliver that food to those cells up there. So no circulatory system, no tissues at all, but yet they can use these specialized cells, in a sense, to maintain their bodies and to keep everything alive. The other thing about sponges is that they keep their body shape using these specialized structures, like we see right here, these spicules, that are secreted by cells called sclerocytes. So these spicules are what give sponges their shape and help them maintain their shape. They're kind of like they kind of create like the skeleton of the sponge, if you would, right? And so they can be either silica-based, they can be calcium-based, calcium carbonate-based, wide diversity of different types of spicules, mostly silica or calcium carbonate-based is what we see here. Okay, sponges are hermaphroditic, and they are going to send their gametes out into the water. So, well, especially they send their sperm out into the water. The eggs, the oocytes, stay inside of the adult sponge. So at one point in time, one sponge will produce sperm. It'll send its sperm out into the water. Sperm will then kind of float through the water, make their way until they come into contact with an oocyte, and then that oocyte will be fertilized by that sperm, and the larvae will develop initially inside of the sponge, and then the larvae are released and they swim away and they settle down somewhere else and they transform into the adult sponge. Okay, and then that sponge that just produced that sperm, it can switch, and a little bit later it will produce eggs. So they kind of switch back. It's what we call sequential hermaphrodites. Often sponges are thought of as less evolved than other animals, but I just want to reiterate that all organisms are equally evolved. All organisms that are extant today are equally evolved to living in their environments. There's no less evolved, more evolved, nothing like that. They might be less complicated, but they're not any less evolved than any other animals. All right, so there's our sponges.